Okay, so here now finally recording a commentary presentation of a Google Point slideshow that I prepared on Kant, Immanuel Kant, and Michel Foucault. What is Enlightenment Part 2? This material is part of my Introduction to Philosophy of Education course that I teach regularly almost every semester. Have been doing that for, these many years, 18 years to be exact. And in this course, early on, the course is trying to explore and look at this figure that I call the philosophical educator. And the philosophical educator has appeared in various important philosophical works, most notably in Plato. Well, it was embodied in Socrates, the real person, who was a character or persona, the principal persona of most of Plato's dialogues. Plato was Socrates' student. And the figure of the liberator in Plato's allegory of the cave is assumed to be based on Socrates. In What is Enlightenment Part 1, we explore Plato's allegory of the cave, and we look at this figure of this liberator as, or emancipator, as the philosophical educator. Now, I'm recording this presentation for a course called Ethics for Educators. And so the presentation could be used in both my Philosophy of Education course or this course, Ethics for Educators. Ethics for Educators presumes already some knowledge or understanding of the philosophical educator, this important persona. In the course on ethics, the philosophical educator, in other words, is the one that we sort of understand to be the ethical educator. So it's sort of like two sides of the same coin. The one who takes up and exercises their moral authority as a teacher is the one who is practicing philosophy. They are a philosophical educator. To understand what's entailed in that, we need to go back then and look at some of the material that is used in the course Intro to Philosophy of Education. Now, I want to make a point with regard to this material in this ethics class, and I'm going to call attention to the conversation that's going on in the course as I'm teaching it now, with the assumption that this film or video could be used again. So it's a point that I'm referring to in a course that was taught originally in the spring semester of 2014, but if it hangs around for a while, that is to say this course and or the course, then this video could be used again, and I don't think that the point would be lost. And here's the point. In the course, we've been focusing a lot on actually existing schools. So most of the students in this course are working in schools. They are in service, they call that. It's the category. They're teachers, they are administrators, and some are not, but are aspiring to get into the schools and know enough about schools, either through observation or through having kids in schools, to be able to make some very intelligent, descriptive statements about schools. We've spent a lot of time talking about the contemporary situation in education as being one that is very close to what Foucault, in the earlier piece that we read by Foucault, which was on the ethics as the practice of freedom. In that piece that we read by Foucault, you'll recall that he talked about the ubiquity of power, that power is something like electricity or like the sun, in this case during the daytime, that's just everywhere. So, or let's use electricity. Electricity is flowing through the lamps and through computers and all over the place. And power is the same sort of almost neutral force that is always operating and moving through all human relations. But, Foucault says, when power emerges in the form of domination, then relations seem to be ossified, or the situation seems to be ossified. That is to say, it appears as if there is little to no possibility of enacting freedom. So we have been describing contemporary education, public schooling in particular, state-run education in the contemporary United States, and the course is being taught in a college in New York State. So the experience that we are drawing from is in the state of New York. I am recording this in the state of Maine. This is where I live, even though I teach at a college in New York State. And here, because of the different, probably the lower population and the different tradition of Maine, and the different sort of, perhaps you could say, norms and values of people here, one doesn't hear education talked about in such dystopian ways. And I have a child who is currently in a public high school here in Portland, Maine, and from everything that she's told me, and also from meeting the teachers who are heavily invested in their work, in a way that reminds me of the work that I do as a professor at a university, insofar as their commitment to it, the professionalism they bring to it, et cetera, et cetera. I'm reminded that many of our depictions of schooling really are local stories or small stories. That is to say, petit récits, right? They are stories that come out of our experiences, and unfortunately, in the New York metropolitan area in particular, this feeling that education has become the latest victim of managerialism, that is to say, top-down structure, seems to be the case in that area. So, thus, we arrive to Foucault and Kant while we're in the midst of talking over and over again about the situation in contemporary schooling as being one in which there's little movement, little possibility for movement. And by movement, I mean freedom. That is to say, and in this particular case, the capacity and the space and time for teachers to be able to teach in a way that they have designed. And so then the question that came up in our conversation last night was that the very matter of ethics in education is a matter of the possibility, following Foucault, of the teacher being able to demonstrate that they are actually enacting a thoughtful plan of action. That is to say, they are teaching thoughtfully, which is to say that they are teaching with and under an ethics. Now, the ethics, that in order for it to be ethics, according to Foucault, it has to be the exercise of the practice of freedom. And this is taking us to Foucault, and to Kant, rather, also Foucault. That is to say, in order for ethics to emerge, one needs to be operating under one's own set of principles. That is to say, through one's reasoning, right? So that's called autonomy, right? From the Greek, the two words auto, meaning self, and nomos, meaning sort of cultural rules. So norms, the word norms, the root of that is nomos. So autonomos would be self-rule or self-principled. Freedom then is the enactment of autonomy. It's self-principled, or the movement or the generation of one's own self's principles. And last night in our discussion, we talked about this as integrity, right? And so what we're calling for in this course of study is the time and space for teachers to be able to be autonomous, and that's to say, to be self-moving, self-governing, and we're calling for right, so the ability to demonstrate the integrity of their work, and I went further last night, and I called for what I would say is sort of the monthly public presentation of one's work. So it's kind of like a conference or a symposium or a seminar where once a month teachers get the opportunity to show some video of their teaching, and then to an audience of their peers, which would include administration, board of education people, parents. They get to say, this is what I'm doing, and of course included in that presentation would be a discussion of how the students are doing, but the emphasis would be on what the teacher is doing. Okay, and so this is important, to focus on the teacher's capacity to teach, to talk about the autonomy of the teacher. And then that brings us then to Kant and Foucault and what is enlightenment. So the panels, the subtitle of the presentation is called, if the main title is what is enlightenment, part 2, the subtitle of it is perceiving and testing limits, in other words, the shadows and the chains, and then education at the boundary, the threshold, the present, in between past and future, taking the risk to think freely and having the courage to do so. So as we'll see, and we know from reading Kant and Foucault's essay in response to Kant, sort of a more contemporary version of Kant's essay, what's important here with regard to this question of autonomy is, and going back to Arendt's idea of responsibility and the taking of responsibility, is the teacher having the courage to take the risk to be autonomous. So in order to truly be autonomous as a teacher, that is to say, to exercise one's moral authority, one needs to take the courage and the risk to do so. If one were to wait for the permission, so to speak, to undertake the work of autonomy, one wouldn't be truly autonomous. So being autonomous, as we know from reading Kant and Foucault, requires that we take some risk and we have the courage to do so. So the panel that follows, that begins it, is the question: how do we perceive our limits? What are the limits we place on ourselves, on how much we can learn, what we should study, etc.? Do we as individuals have within us the power and the capacity not just to perceive them but overcome them? So I think a lot of what we've been doing in this course has been to try to understand the limits that are placed on us. And at the end of the Foucault essay, we see him talking about this as crucial. Being able to find the spaces of freedom entails our ability to find what's limiting us and the conditions that are limiting us. We've been doing that in the course. But what we haven't really done, I think, enough of, and I think to me this again comes back to the question of ethics, is to strategize and think about how we can overcome those limits. So Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment, was written in 1784. It was responding to a question that was posed in a journal. The question was, what is enlightenment? And Kant begins the essay, and the first paragraph of the essay reads as follows, in the translation that I'm using. Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed tutelage. Tutelage, to be tutored, represents the inability to use one's own understanding without another's guidance. This tutelage is self-imposed if its cause lies not in the lack of understanding, but in the indecision and the lack of courage to use one's own mind without another's guidance. Dare to know, sapere aude, have the courage to use your own reasoning, is therefore the motto of the Enlightenment. So, we arrive then at this really important point, which is to say that the question that beyond critique, beyond mapping our limits, arises then the challenge of overcoming this condition by having the courage to use our own understanding. Have the courage to use your own reasoning. Have the courage to think for the sake of thinking. One could leave it at that and sort of put that out there. And I suspect that now, talking very practically as a kind of midterm assignment that we're heading into the midterm, this motto could be put out there, and this challenge that's put forward by Kant could be put out there, and it could be quite simply stated: what specifically would be entailed if you, student, exercised the courage to use your own reasoning. What would that entail? So, have the courage to your own reasoning? Fine. What would that entail? So that may be a midterm question, but we move on to Kant, to Foucault. So that's not to dismiss or see as less important for our concerns Kant, but I think what Foucault allows us to do is to move forward through the highlights of Kant's essay, and then also get to a more contemporary sensibility of the implications of Kant's essay. So Foucault's reading of Kant. Kant defines the Enlightenment, the Aufklärung, as an Ausgang, an exit or a way out. This is really important because it has to do, once again, with not simply perceiving the limits, but perceiving the fissures or the possible ways out or exits out of those limits. So if we think of the current educational system as this perceived, apparently indomitable structure, how do we get out of it? And we think back to the allegory of the cave, and the cave as this place where that we are attempting to move out of. For Foucault, Kant is attempting to understand enlightenment as a way out, and from a historical perspective, he is looking for a difference. And he's asking, Foucault says, what difference does today introduce with respect to yesterday? And this question is very interesting and very important to me, because I think that when I speak in my lecture on the allegory of the cave about the emancipation of the student, entailing the student being able to perceive difference, to see difference, which means both to be autonomous and see for themselves, that is to say, to think differently, but also to welcome difference. The question, what difference does today introduce with respect to yesterday, is related to this sense of emancipation taking one into the place of autonomy, which means to think differently. So the difference, what difference does today introduce with respect to yesterday, is a sort of reminder of the possibility of autonomy. Foucault goes on, Kant indicates the way out that characterizes the Enlightenment is a process. It releases us from a state of immaturity. Process is important because, and in Foucault, and I would like to emphasize that too, insofar as we're not, it's not as if you are emancipated and you are all of a sudden autonomous. Autonomy is, I would argue, and I think Foucault is making this point, is a process insofar as it's a struggle. So what's important is to think of, for example, in the allegory of the cave, the gradual movement of the prisoner outside of the cave. This is significant because in that case, it wasn't something that just happened right away. The breaking of the chains didn't lead automatically to emancipation. It was a slow and gradual process. And for Foucault, and I think this is what is key for us in terms of education, emancipation or autonomy is an ongoing struggle. It's something that we have to do every day. And again, the question: what difference does today introduce? Does today introduce with respect to yesterday? Is a question of the need to take up the struggle for autonomy every day. The process involves the quote-unquote escape from immaturity, and immaturity being the inability to exercise one's autonomy. A change that one brings about in oneself. So in this case, enlightenment, which we were talking about as an individual thing in terms of Plato, has to be considered both as a process in which people participate collectively, so it's a collective movement, as well as an act of courage to be accomplished personally. I think it's very significant. And it also, again, relates back to the issue of ethics. Because if ethics is a relational thing, it's not just the ethos or the integrity of the individual person and how they present themselves, but it also is a relational phenomenon. And then it means that the process of emancipation, the process of autonomy, is something that should and is undertaken in relation to others, and so far as we are in our ways of being with others in this world, trying to bring about the conditions for autonomy as a cultural phenomena, right? So to use a formula that Jean-Paul Sartre used, I can only be free insofar as others are free too, right? And so in this case, Foucault is saying that for Kant, enlightenment is both a process in which people participate collectively, but it's also an act of courage to be accomplished personally. And so Kant, according to Foucault, describes enlightenment as the moment when humanity is going to put its own reason to use without subjecting itself to any authority other than its own reasoning or thinking or freedom. And in the essay that Kant offers, there's in his essay on enlightenment, there's this interesting point where he's sort of gesturing to that moment, but also recognizing that in the current context, we have a limited sense of our ability to be autonomous. That is to say, he makes this private-public distinction. And that's something to think about, because in view of Kant's essay, it almost sounds like education, schooling, formal education, isn't necessarily a place where we exercise the authority of our own reasoning. So maybe autonomy for Kant really isn't present in the educational context. I think it most certainly would be for Foucault, and I would argue for me, I know for a case that I'm advocating for autonomy in the educational. That's where we first experience it, when we are already in pre-K and all the way through schooling and high schooling, and then in college. You know, that autonomy, the space of autonomy, if there's any place in our society where it's cultivated and it grows, it's in educational spaces. So, Foucault, going back to the Enlightenment, the Aufklärung as an Ausgang, an exit. The exit or way out happens at the limits, I've already said that, where we discover what is different about today, and where we take up the critical attitude of the Enlightenment, where we take up ethics as the practice of freedom. So again, I think this is an important point I'm trying to make here, which is that the critical attitude is an attitude of the philosophical educator. And the philosophical educator is then one who isn't simply making critique, that is to say, recognizing the limits that are placed upon their own autonomy and in turn the autonomy of the students that they're working with. But furthermore, the critical attitude is the attitude of one who actually takes the risk and has the courage to enact autonomy despite those limits. And so Foucault says, by attitude, I mean a mode of relating to contemporary reality, a voluntary choice. In the end, a way of thinking and feeling, a way of acting and behaving, a relation of belonging that presents itself a task, a bit like what the ancient Greek philosophers called an ethos. So this is important. Attitude is coming out of a choice of how we respond to what we understand to be the limits that are placed before us. This is very important. So again, the philosophical educator has the critical attitude, and takes on the ethos of one who is autonomous. Again, ethos is a way of being and of behavior. It's consistent conduct, and it means integrity. Okay, it's visible, perceivable to others. That's really important. It's something, again, I talked about this in the seminar last night, that you are able to demonstrate, and you could account for it. So again, the importance of being able to publicly present an account of your ethos. It's a concrete form of freedom. It's demonstrated enactment of freedom. How I use my freedom, how I care for myself, and in turn care for others. This is very important. So Foucault, the philosopher, has a particular assigned duty to fulfill, his or her ethos. So this is important for our concern. So we could add the philosophical educator has a particular assigned duty to fulfill his or her ethos. Their ethos is to care about how others care for themselves, to be concerned about how others take up their freedom, to be concerned about how others take up their conduct. This is an example of what I call philosophical education. So Foucault talks about then Kant's essay is what he calls an expression of the critical attitude of modernity. So the attitude of what I'm calling the philosophical educator is also what we might call the critical attitude of modernity, which is to say the critical attitude of that recognizes that there's a break in tradition, and with it what he calls a feeling of novelty, fluidity of time and place. So the consciousness, if you will, of modernity is felt in this critical attitude of the Enlightenment. The critical attitude of the philosopher, another way of saying, is expressed through an understanding of that we live in a time that is different now epocally than the time before. So the breakthrough that happens with the Enlightenment and then it's carried forward into the era that's called modernity or modernism is the recognition that we are no longer in a time of tradition. We're no longer bound by tradition in the way that we once were. The authority of tradition isn't the only authority. There's also the future. All right, so now we're relating, the attitude of modernity is one in which you're both relating to the past as having value, but not ultimate authority. And so that you also have the future and the possibility of what's to come. This inclusion of the future and the novelty that the future will bring is characteristic of what we call modernity. Right? So if you think about, again, the allegory of the cave as an illustration, now, of course, Plato was not using these terms at all, but the allegory can be used to think about this point, that in the cave and the chains represent the sort of unquestioned authority of tradition. Once those chains are broken, now the outward movement is to a new place, a place that along the way is encountered as something quite unknown, and quite new, and quite novel. So modernity is the recognition, the critical attitude of modernity is the recognition that there's a break with tradition, there's a feeling of novelty, fluidity of time and place. Foucault turns to Baudelaire, who wrote under the ethos of modern consciousness, and who was adopting an attitude with respect to the movement of time and place, recapturing something eternal that appears within what he calls the present, making the present heroic. And here's where I have been gathering my category, what I call the heroic present, which is where, for me, the time and place of learning is happening. So while there is this recognition of a future, there's also this special attention placed on the present. So part of the critical attitude of modernity is the recognition that the present, in some way, this time that we're in, right this moment, right now, is unique and that's part of the possibility of the breaking from the past means that there isn't a sense of predetermination, there isn't this sense of tradition reproducing things, but there's always this opportunity for something new to emerge in the world of that humans inhabit and that we create and that rather we make and specifically the life that we live, and that so that this present moment is that time when that begins. So the future begins now. That's another way of putting it. And learning captures this moment of the future beginning now. And that's why it's called heroic, because it stands out it stands out as a powerful occasion or event where something new is beginning. So the heroic present, perceiving the concreteness of the present moment, and yet moving freely in and with it. The individual objects appear endowed, this is a quote from Baudelaire, endowed with an impulsive life like the soul of their creator. So there's this sense in which the moment has something that is more powerful than any other moment, and it sort of stands out. So where is that moment? When is that moment occurring? When we experience that moment, we know that we've entered into a place that's very profound and very significant, and it's from that moment that something different is possible. So if the way out happens, that is to say, going back to the beginning, the way out that is the Ausgang, so the Enlightenment is experienced as a way out. If that happens via the courageous use of reasoning, right? So if the Enlightenment is an exit, if the Aufklärung is an Ausgang, then the exit is happening when we take the risk to use our reasoning, free thinking. Then it's an attitude of experimentation, of testing the limits of one's perception of what's given, of taking serious one's autonomy, which entails understanding the power and risk and responsibility of being autonomous. So this is slide number 22. It's very important to spend some time with it and to really sort of think about what it means. But what I'm suggesting here is that when you ask, well, what exactly do you mean when you say that I am courageously exercising my autonomy? Give me a little more. Here's the little more that I'm giving you. It's experimentation. It's the idea of using, of being experimental in one's teaching. That's where the risk is, right? Of testing the limits of your perception of what's given. That is to say, of taking seriously one's autonomy. So autonomy then becomes, for Foucault, what I'm suggesting as well, a matter of experimentation. So, a philosophical educator is one who's taking up this attitude. For Foucault, the critical attitude is described as a permanent critique of our historical era, which is oriented specifically towards the contemporary limits of the necessary. And that's put into italics because it's important. So, the critical attitude is oriented toward the contemporary limits of the necessary. That is to say, toward what is not or is no longer indispensable for the constitution of ourselves as autonomous subjects. That's a quote from Foucault. So, being able to understand what the situation is and what we can do with it. In other words, we need not think about the limits that we impose upon ourselves, that is to say, those concepts we use to govern our lives, specifically in relation to this or that particular sphere of our lives. We need to think about those limits. That's what we're thinking about. So first and foremost, but we've been doing that in this course, we need, what are the limits presented to us, and that we then in turn impose upon ourselves. And it's the imposition of these on ourselves that's the key here. That's the difference between Kant and then what Foucault is taking up in Plato. In Plato, you know, I had a student once saying to me asking over and over again in seminar, at least in the time that we talked about Plato's allegory, how did the prisoners get there? And my point was, I was always perplexed by this question, but my answer was like, they've always been there. This is the condition of humans that aren't able to step outside and question where they are, how they came, you know, the situation that they're in. It's the moment in which you can step outside of the context and the situation that you're in, that you're able to then have the critical attitude, the philosophical attitude. So to say that schooling, for example, in our context, is a certain way is one thing. But to then have to look carefully at our work and to ask ourselves, to what extent are we allowing those limits to dictate what we do, with an emphasis on allowing them? That is to say, to what extent are we making a choice? That's the question. That is the question. For Foucault, you can never give up, and this is for Arendt as well, we can never relinquish our moral authority, that is to say, our responsibility. That's just part of the human condition, our capacity to think, which is to be autonomous. So, following Foucault, we can describe the attitude of the philosophical educator, here's a direct quote from Foucault, as, quote, consisting in a critique of what we are saying, thinking, and doing, through what he calls a historical ontology of ourselves. This philosophical ethos may be characterized as a limit attitude. We have to be at the frontiers. Now, what he means by limit attitude, that's something to explore and to think about, but my understanding is that limit attitude isn't a limited attitude, but it's an attitude that arises at the limits, right? So it's this attitude of understanding where those limits are and how we can get beyond them. So this is what in other work I call being in the threshold. So the threshold scholar is the teacher, educator, thinker who stands in between today, yesterday rather, and tomorrow. And that time in between is the time in which they think about where they're going, where they've come from, and where they're going. But the yesterday, so to speak, is also the sort of cultural norms, ideas, in our case, policies, laws, structures that govern our life. To what extent then are we able to step beyond those? That's what it means to have a limit attitude. So the limit attitude is to try to understand where are those limits, where are those boundaries, what are those walls, and then to try to find the portals, so to speak, where we can get in between, inside the wall. So that's why threshold to me is important, because it's the way in which we move from one space to another, right? And so a portal in the wall. So if we think of the educational structure that we're in today as one of the logic of domination, we can think of it as the simile would be, or the metaphor, as a wall, right? So it's like a wall that seems to be impenetrable. But all walls, Foucault is saying, and I'm suggesting, have their points of entry, right? So there has to be a way in, there has to be a way out. The threshold scholar, or the philosophical educator, is the one who has a limit attitude insofar as they're sort of dwelling inside the wall. That is to say, in between the wall, not inside the wall. That's, I think, mixing metaphors and confusing things. So the limit attitude is a form of criticism. And he, quoting Foucault again, criticism indeed consists of analyzing and reflecting on our limits, right? So the critical attitude enacts criticism. It entails taking a cultural and sociological inventory, a historical investigation into the events that have led us to constitute ourselves and to recognize ourselves as subjects of what we are doing, thinking, and saying. That is to say, that's precisely what we have been doing in the course, but then the conclusion of this presentation is relevant to where we go next, which is to say, to a kind of experimental attitude. And so the last slide I conclude with is a quotation from Foucault, where he says, we must also be, the attitude, this critical, or what I'm calling philosophical attitude, must also be experimental. It must be an experimental one. It must put itself to the test of reality, of contemporary reality, both to grasp the points where change is possible and desirable, and to determine the precise form this change should take. Foucault adds, that this is a practical attitude. And I find that so fascinating and so evocative that he calls it a practical attitude. Because when we think of practical in contemporary America, we don't think of something like this, which is critical and is looking to make change and is learning to act courageously. Practical means, well, it would be something like, well, be practical and, recognize what you can and cannot do, and be reasonable. Someone who's prudent is someone who is practical, right? We wouldn't necessarily use the word practical to describe someone who's experimental. So it's interesting that Foucault calls this a practical attitude, but what he's saying is it's something that's put into practice. And this is why I really appreciate Foucault's philosophy, because it's not a philosophy of the abstract. It's not a philosophy of speculation. It's not a philosophy that's building a system through language. It's a philosophy that gives us the language from which we can think about how we can put things into action that will help us respond to the situation that we find ourselves in. And in that sense, it's a philosophy of the Enlightenment, which is to say, the philosophy of autonomy and the exercise, the courageous exercise of one's reasoning. Okay, and that's where I'm going to leave it for now on Kant and Foucault, Enlightenment, Part 2.